Hi, I'm Jim Delgado.
And I'm Mike Fletcher with the Sea Hunters.
And we're live from the dive.
And why are we here, Jim?
Well, it's the anniversary of Titanic hitting the iceberg, Mike. And you know, it's funny for me, oftentimes, I'm on the deck when you're making a really deep dive. But 5 years ago, today, I was on a dive to Titanic, which is certainly the deepest dive I've ever made, and probably tops yours at 2.5 miles or nearly 5 kilometers.
Well, I don't have anywhere near as good a Titanic story as yours. The only thing I can say is that I was involved in the hunt for Carpathia, which was the ship that saved the survivors of the Titanic.
Absolutely, and you realize that I was diving on Titanic while you were hunting for Carpathia. I came back from Titanic, and we all hooked up together here in Halifax.
I didn't realize that. At the same time.
Yeah, look at the footage, yeah.
So when I was out there off the coast of Ireland, you were on the bottom of the North Atlantic on the deck of the Titanic.
Yeah, and it was pretty incredible because in this case, to dive Titanic, as you know, I mean, you're down so deep, the pressure is so intense that no diver can ever do it. So you have to lock yourself into a tiny submersible. In this case, the Russian Mir submersibles, drop for 2.5 hours into the cold, dark, crushing depths of the North Atlantic to land on the bottom and then approach Titanic. And it is every possible adjective you can think of. Awe-inspiring, terrifying, incredible. It's a moment frozen in time. It's so huge. It's so sad. It just overwhelms you.
Sounds like a lot of emotions. So you admit you were scared?
Oh, I admit I was scared. I admit I was sad. I admit I cried at one stage. You're there on the deck looking at the spot where people were getting in or not getting into the lifeboats. And I was at the spot where the Strausses were. And if you know the story, here's a man and a woman married for a long time, very much in love with each other. She can get in the boats, but he can't. And so she chooses to step out of that boat and walks hand in hand with her husband to die. And it's just a story until you're there. And it floods you with emotion, because if you've ever loved and lost, it's a story that moves you. And you cry. And anybody that's been down there and says they haven't cried, they're lying. Genya Chernev was the sub-pilot who took me down, and he was very good. Cool customer, just knew exactly where to go. I had my own suggestions, and I'd say, you know, knowing the story, let's go here, let's go here. And he did it. He knew his way around. We actually found a couple spots that he hadn't been to.
Wow.
Which was fun.
And he probably knows the wreck of Titanic better than anyone.
Well, Genya, the other pilots, Anatoly, they do. There's a lot of folks who've gone down repeatedly. But still, as a maritime historian, as an archaeologist who'd studied this story, I was conversant with a bit of it. And so I could say, let's go to this lifeboat position. Let's go here. And in one case, let's go drive right in between the two massive engines into the stern itself to where the black gang, the guys that worked as the engineers were. Every one of them died, Mike. They were some of the heroes in this story. And they stayed at their posts and died so the ship would have power to keep the pumps going and electricity running to call ships like Carpathia to come and help.
That's right. And the Carpathia did get there, of course, long after the ship sank.
Had they not arrived, hundreds of others would have died in the Titanic disaster, either of exposure or having their lifeboats swamped by the rising sea and the wind.
Because it was almost dead calm that night, which is a very rare occurrence in the North Atlantic.
And the wind was coming up, and some of those ships were those lifeboats were heavily loaded.
Yeah.
So what was really ironic was coming away from the boat deck of Titanic and then hooking up with you and Clive and John and looking here in Halifax at the footage of Carpathia's boat deck and saying, yep, this matches, this matches, this matches, this is Carpathia. And realizing at that one moment when I was looking at the boat deck and the empty davits for Carpathia's lifeboats, realizing this funny juxtaposition that I had just been on one boat deck, here was another, separated by so much space and time, and yet for a brief moment, on April 15th, 1912, those two boat decks saw the same lifeboats being handled, the boats of Titanic.
I'm trying to remember, Carpathia was not a White Star liner.
Belonged to Cunard. There's no competition between lighthouses, there's no competition between ships or mariners when it comes to rescuing somebody else. It's one of the oldest traditions of this.
No competition when it comes to rescue, but lots of competitions when it's who can carry the most passengers, who can cross the Atlantic the fastest. And you know, to this day, people still say that's really what sank Titanic.
Yeah, you don't often hear about the second person to do this or that. It's usually the first or the fastest. And I think that did play a role.
So for the sea hunters, the next best story in telling the Titanic was to go and hunt for the ship that saves the Titanic. And when I tell people that we found the Carpathia, they somehow think that the Carpathia sank that night. And of course it didn't. It returned to shore, returned the survivors to America.
Sailed right into New York, landed them, and then Titanic's boats at the pier where they would have landed.
And then 5 years later, during the First World War, Carpathia becomes a victim of a German torpedo. Clive wants to go and find her. We do, and by finding Carpathia and telling her story, we also get to tell the story of Titanic. So,
absolutely.
And you know what? That's what kicked off the Econova version or the Halifax version of the Sea Hunters, and even our meeting and our association. It was the first hunt.
Yeah.
I think we pretty much told our part. And happy anniversary, Titanic.
Indeed. So now it's your turn. Get up off that couch, go out into the mountains, the deserts, and the oceans, and search for history. You'll never have a more rewarding adventure, or so Uncle Clive tells us.
Didn't you steal that line?
I did. Sorry, Clive.